I was young when the nation was young. It was the spring of 1787. I had just graduated from medical school here in Philadelphia. The town was abuzz over the arrival of a most distinguished group, delegates to the Constitutional Convention. It had been 11 years since we had declared our independence. In the meantime, the states had gotten carried away with the idea, printing their own money, maintaining their own armies. There had even been a rebellion in Massachusetts. Things were getting out of control. That's why George Washington and other delegates wanted a strong government. Well, those delegates weren't all alike, though. They came from cities and farms and plantations, from big states and little ones. They represented the North and the South. They opposed slavery or depended on it completely. Still, there was much the delegates shared. They were rich mostly, so they didn't want to change things too much. Yet, they were highly educated and willing to try new ideas. They'd already fought off one king, so they weren't going to concentrate total power in any single ruler. And they didn't want the states to be swallowed up by the national government. The Constitution they crafted reflected all these shared characteristics. It proposed a government just strong enough to maintain an army and carry out other specific tasks. That government had a new form, an elected president, whose power was balanced by Congress and the courts. All this required many compromises. The one I regret most was the decision to allow slavery. Still, by May 1790, all 13 states had agreed to the Constitution. Within months, the decision was made to move the nation's capital to the District of Columbia. It would be in the South, all right, but about as close to the North as you could get. Also, like the Constitution, the capital city would be all new, carefully laid out, its plan as artfully engineered as a clock. Oh, another thing those delegates shared was an intense curiosity about the West. They, well, all of us really, were mesmerized by its promise. In fact, if I were a young doctor starting out again, that's where I would go, over the Appalachians and into the great beyond. That's where the future lies, to the West.
Dig this map, listen to my rap. Dig this map, listen to my rap. When the U.S. fought the Revolutionary War, 13 colonies bordered our eastern shore. We won that war in 1783, and the English gave up land to the Mississippi. We made a deal with France in 1803 that let us buy all the Louisiana Territory. We took land from Spain in 1810, and in 1813 we did it again. Then it was decided how the United States and Canada should be divided. The 49th parallel's where the boundary was planned, so in 1818 England owed us more land. The very next year we signed a treaty with Spain. The rest of Florida was the prize we gained. In 1842 there was something new, more land from England that the states were due. In 1845 we annexed Texas as a state, and war with Mexico was soon our fate. Meanwhile, up in the Oregon country, another chapter was added to our nation's story. How to claim the land from shore to shore. In 1846, we added some more. In 1848, the war with Mexico ended. We won the war and the land we defended. With the Mexican cession, we gained western land, and our southwest border reached the Rio Grande. The Gadsden Purchase was made in 1853, and then the country stretched from sea to shining sea. Then Russia had land that she wanted to sell, a place called Alaska that few people knew well. So I guess with that, my map rap is through. We've gone from coast to coast and Alaska too. Dig this map. Now you've heard my rap. Dig this map. Now you've heard my rap.
It is the spring of 1804. A small band of men sets out on the Mississippi River. They are headed into the unknown. The United States had bought the Louisiana Territory, and President Thomas Jefferson wanted to find out what the country had gotten for its money. He hoped there would be a water route to the Pacific Ocean. To lead the expedition, President Jefferson chose his secretary, Meriwether Lewis. He selected as his partner his old Army commander, William Clark. Near the port of St. Louis, they set out with supplies for several months of travel. In fact, they would be gone for over 2 years. The notes and drawings they made along the way gave Americans their first look at the West. The plan was to locate the water route by tracing the Missouri River to its source. The wonders of the journey began early, as the expedition moved along the Missouri through the Great Plains.
We beheld a most beautiful landscape. The plain extends without interruption as far as can be seen.
And farther on,
the country intersected with deep ravines and steep, irregular hills. Immense herds of buffalo, which we saw in every direction.
these new landscapes had their own peoples, Native Americans who, as often as not, helped the journey westward.
The Sioux is a bold-looking people, the young men handsome and well-made. They live by the bow and arrow.
More than once, the group came to a fork in the river. Which path to take? Which would lead to the source of the Missouri?
To mistake the stream now, and to ascend such stream much further, and then be obliged to return and take the other, would not only lose us the whole season, but would probably so dishearten the party that it might defeat the expedition altogether.
Whether wise or lucky, Lewis and Clark made the right choice at fork after fork. But what lay ahead was chancier, more treacherous. The Rockies, some of the most forbidding peaks in North America.
We are about to enter on the most perilous and difficult part of our voyage. The adjacent mountains commonly rise so high as to conceal the more distant from our view.
For 3 months, they inched their way through the mountains. The search for a path to the sea had turned into a cold, perilous climb and was taking them far beyond U.S. territory. At last, Clark saw level country ahead. They worked their way along the Snake River and on to the Columbia. In November 1805, they finally reached the Pacific. They spent the winter in a hastily erected fort near the Oregon coast, enduring constant rain and a profound longing for home. In springtime, they made their way back, across the Rockies, to the Missouri, and down to St. Louis. Everywhere along their 2.5-year journey, a round trip of 8,000 miles, they continued to map their progress and record all they saw. Lewis and Clark opened a door on a shimmering prize. There would be later explorations, of course, but this was the first of its kind, the most ambitious, the most carefully noted. None other would do so much to shape America's vision of the West. There's no stopping a people with a sense of purpose. I know this in my heart. I sense it in all I read. Right here, John O'Sullivan, one of the writers I most admire, calls our great movement west the fulfillment of our manifest destiny. So the West shall be one. Our destiny is to rule from sea to sea.
The frontier, that outer edge of settlement, it never stayed one place for long. In 1776, the Appalachian Mountains marked the frontier. Just 25 years later, Americans were crossing the Appalachians in droves. The frontier was heading toward the Mississippi River and moving fast. Wherever they came from, even from across the sea, pioneer families were leaving places that had become worn out, crowded, expensive. From the north, from the south, most pioneers headed straight west. Nearly everyone lived off the land, which itself had to be cleared for planting. As in the past, land the settlers wanted was already occupied by Native Americans. The government set out to remove them through any means possible. Sometimes those who went peacefully suffered the most. As the Native Americans were removed, the number of settlers grew, and life along the frontier changed dramatically. Northern and southern sections became more like the North and South back home. This meant growing industry in the North, big plantations and slave labor in the South. The slavery issue had national impact. It was not only a moral problem, it was also a struggle for political power, one that intensified as Western territories applied for statehood. Southerners wanted to extend slavery into new states, so slave states would never be outnumbered. Northerners wanted slavery to reach no farther. So even in new lands, old differences between North and South continued. The nation was moving westward to the Mississippi, overcoming natural obstacles, clearing Native Americans, both with the same brute force. But the issue of slavery would not be pushed aside. My grandfather was chief of the entire Paiute Nation and was camped near Humboldt Lake when a party traveling eastward from California was seen coming. My grandfather jumped up, clasped his hands together, and cried aloud, "My white brothers, my long-looked-for white brothers have come at last." The following spring, the people that my grandfather called our white brothers set everything we had left on fire. It was all we had for the winter, and it was all burnt.
I tell you, Americans have got to be the most ingenious folks on Earth. It's hardly been 50 years since we declared our independence, but the progress we've made is astounding. You take the transportation problem. We had all this territory, but no way of getting there fast and cheap. Now everybody knew the city that came up with the best way of going west would get bigger and richer than the others. And some wheeler dealers in New York had an idea. They dug this 40-foot wide ditch, stretching 360 miles across the wilderness. Thousands of workers it took, and they were well paid too. 80 cents a day. The Erie Canal, they called it, an engineering marvel grand as the pyramids. You ride a steamboat up the Hudson River to Albany. Then the Erie Canal takes you to Buffalo, and Lake Erie carries you straight to Ohio. It's a smart little system. The canal costs you $8 whole bucks. More than a week's wages, I admit, but that works out to only 4 cents a mile. It's got thousands of folks moving west, starting up farms, and then sending their wheat and timber and stuff right back on the canal to New York, where folks pay good money for it. Well, Philadelphia isn't gonna take this lying down, so they up and build the Pennsylvania Canal, straight to Pittsburgh and the Ohio River. Of course, there's mountains blocking the way, but this doesn't stop them either. Now, Baltimore wasn't sitting still. Those sly devils got the federal government to pitch in on something called the National Road. 64 feet wide, it goes from Cumberland, Maryland, all the way to Vandalia, Illinois. Soon there were herds of Conestoga wagons heading west over that road. But is Baltimore satisfied? No. Going by road is slower, costs more. So the city borrowed this newfangled idea from England. It's called a railroad. At first, people wondered whether an engine could ever replace the horse. So there's this race. The horse against the Tom Thumb steam engine, which was sort of a power-packed tea kettle on wheels. Well, the Tom Thumb breaks down and loses. But that's just a temporary setback. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad starts using the contraption. Now, quick as you can spit, other cities are building their own canals and roads, even railroads. You never did see such a race. And who's winning? Well, New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia are all going great guns. Places alongside the canals and roads are doing pretty well, too. And those frontier towns. That's where farmers come to sell their goods and buy supplies. And when folks head even farther west, these towns will be plumb in the middle, smack dab in between the east and the west. Meanwhile, trips that used to take weeks now go by a good bit quicker. Just goes to show you what a little competition will do. With every place trying to outdo the other, the whole country is getting bigger and better. The east, the west, whichever way you turn, it looks like everybody's winning. Yes, sirree.
The far west of the mid-1800s. No place for the timid. Well, sure, the Spanish had been there for centuries. The Native Americans even longer. Still, it was the harshest sort of place. How come? Well, for most Americans, it was real far away. hard to get to, and downright unlivable. At first, anyway. So it attracted some pretty weird types. Even ordinary folks, worn down by the journey, ground down by the surroundings, well, they couldn't help but be affected. Texas. American settlement of the far west started out there. It wasn't even part of the U.S., but land cost a tenth of what it did back home. Farther west, the Rocky Mountains. The stamping ground of trappers and traders. Loners mostly. Risk-takers all. Most folks, except those who'd gone to Texas, stayed out of the far west until the 1840s. The Native Americans scared them. So did getting across the Great Plains and the mountains. But people with land to sell painted the far west to look like paradise. So the families in their wagon trains finally moved out. It could take 6 months to get from Missouri to any place that ordinary folks would think worth settling down. 15, 20 miles a day was real progress. Heaving along those trails, hungry, dirty. There wasn't any Sunday ride in the country. Whole families ended up half crazy with weariness. At least one group, though, the Mormons, had a vision that helped them carry on. A vision of a place where other people would leave them and their religion alone. They found it in the Utah desert, settled down, and made a world all their own. California, where the 49ers were drawn by a more earthly kind of vision. Gold. Those prospectors and their pals were a wild and greedy bunch, so full of dreams. But that was said about a lot of settlers in the far west. Sometimes it was true. But to live out there, they did have to be tough and determined. By 1850, they'd settled several little pockets of the far west. Still hard to reach. Far from each other, too. Rough to live in, at least at the start. But you gotta hand it to them. They were making a go of it.
The 1850s was a prosperous time for both North and South. The more they prospered, though, the less they had in common. In the North, it was an age of invention. Making new things required factories, lots of them, lots of workers, too. Factory towns sprang up, the older cities expanded, and northern populations soared as new jobs attracted immigrants from across the sea. Also in the North, improved tools made farming more profitable, with fewer hands. And there were faster ways of moving about. Railroads crisscrossed the region, linking people and places. So Northerners had more and more in common. A sense of progress, a fascination with machines and all they could do.
The South wasn't standing still. Yet its future seemed to lie in the opposite direction, in agriculture, not industry. Because the South didn't have the money to build factories, or the swift rivers to power them. Just as important, most Southerners with any choice in the matter preferred working with the land, rather than covering it over. Further, the South's richest crop, cotton, required much human tending, which was done by slaves.
The differences between North and South could be seen even in their two biggest cities. New York was a center for trade, manufacturing, and banking.
New Orleans was prospering too, though more modestly. It was a center for trading cotton.
And slaves. It was that business, the buying and selling of human beings, that drove North and South even further apart. Northern factories didn't depend on cotton picked by slaves. That was the practical side of the issue. There was also the moral side. More and more Northerners wanted slavery contained or abolished outright.
Many Southerners regarded working conditions in the North as even worse than slavery. More important, they wanted to hold on to the world they had made, a world built on the backs of slaves, and they feared the growing wealth and strength of the North.
To Northerners, the South was backward, immoral.
To Southerners, the North was pushy, hypocritical, threatening.
Those differences grew wider and wider. And as the nation expanded ever farther westward, the question was, would slavery expand too?
Noisy. And then quiet. Noisy. And then quiet again. That's how it was in the America of the 1850s. When tempers flared. When voices were raised. When a storm was building. And when every compromise, every period of quiet, was briefer than the last. It was as though the North and the South were becoming two separate countries. The deepest division between them was slavery, and whether it would be extended west into new territories. The focus was on the U.S. Senate, where each side's power balanced the others. But every new state threatened that balance. Would it be slave or free? Would it side with the North or the South? Because both sides wanted to preserve the balance, the map was repeatedly redrawn. The earliest such effort, the Missouri Compromise, depended on a single line straight across the map. New states north of the line would be free. South of it, they would be slave. That compromise, that period of quiet, held for 30 years. Then, in the Compromise of 1850, the map was again redrawn, but a further complication was added. For the first time, slaves who escaped and made their way to freedom could be hunted down and taken back. An uneasy sort of calm, at best. And it didn't last long, since there were soon more new territory to wrangle over. This time, Congress voted to let settlers in the Kansas and Nebraska territories decide the slavery question for themselves, which they tried to do by swarming into Kansas and shooting up the opposition. Clearly, the storm was gathering strength. The North, bigger, richer, more densely populated. The North was getting impatient. To Southern leaders, Northern efforts to limit slavery seemed more and more like a threat to abolish it. Fearing that the old balance of power was tipping against them, Southerners even began threatening to withdraw their states from the Union. The South withdrawing, seceding.
Inconceivable at first. But Abraham Lincoln changed that. He was the first presidential candidate pledged to oppose the spread of slavery into new territories. So he terrified the South. When Northern votes put Lincoln in the White House in 1860, the storm was at hand. Lincoln, his words, his ideas, his determination, his presidency. Faced with that prospect, the Southern states seceded. At last, the storm had begun.